G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. We are in the book of Zechariah and we are up to chapter 10, verse 8, going on down to chapter 11, verse 17. Our last session, we saw the conquests of Alexander the Great. He comes down through Syria, Phoenicia, especially Tyre and Sidon. If you remember, Tyre was a fortified city off the coast. Neither Shalmaneser, the emperor of Assyria, or Nebuchadnezzar, emperor of king of Babylon, who besieged it for 13 years, could take it. But God brings judgment through Alexander the Great, and he took it in 7 months. He then moves down from there into Philistia, and they couldn't withstand him either, and he moves across to Jerusalem. But God holds him in Jerusalem. Alexander, when he got to Jerusalem, God would not allow him, not allow the destruction of Jerusalem or the temple. Alexander actually didn't enter. He stood outside when he saw the high priest coming out. So he did not enslave or come back to Jerusalem to put it under any tribute. He left it alone. And in fact, he allowed the Jewish high priest to rule over Jerusalem. In chapter 9, verses 9 to 10, we see the coming of the King Messiah, that is, where Zechariah switches from the Greek king to the Jewish king. And in verses 9 and 10 of Zechariah 9, we see the first and second coming blended into one picture there. In verse 9, we see the Jewish king. He comes bringing salvation. He's just, he's lowly, and he's riding upon an ass. He's not riding upon a great white steed as conquerors does, but he's riding upon a donkey. And then in verse 10, we see the second coming, where we see all instruments of war being removed. Messiah will cause peace to come worldwide, for he is going to rule worldwide from Jerusalem. We find the redemption of Israel in verses 11 to 17 of chapter 9, where the Lord will deliver them. In the final wars of Israel against the Gentile nations, God will empower and energize the Jews to be able to fight their war well. But it will ultimately be God who will deliver them. We see the salvation of Israel in chapter 10, verses 1 to 7, with God punishing the shepherds. They were the Jewish leaders who led the flock astray. But what we see also is in that chapter, in those verses, we see that Messiah becomes a cornerstone. He is the battle bow. He will be the one who will save Israel. And now we come into the section of the restoration of Israel in verses 8 to 12 of chapter 10. I will hiss for them and gather them, for I have redeemed them, and they shall increase as they have increased. And I will sow them among the peoples, and they shall remember me in far countries. They shall live with their children and shall return. I will bring them again also out of the land of Egypt and gather them out of Assyria. And I'll bring them into the land of Gilead and Lebanon, and place shall not be found for them. And he will pass through the sea of affliction and will smite the waves in the sea, and all the depths of the Nile shall dry up. And the pride of Assyria shall be brought down, and the sceptre of Egypt shall depart. And I will strengthen them in Jehovah, and they shall walk up and down in his name, says Jehovah. So these verses now conclude this section with the restoration of Israel. Verses 8 to 9 deal with the regathering of Israel as a result of their redemption. First, he says, I will hiss for them and gather them. The Hebrew word sharak means the shrill whistle a shepherd uses to control his sheep. So what we see is that shepherds in the Negev desert today still call their sheep around them in this way. Yes, there could be several shepherds with their flocks mingled together as they feed, and in order to gather their own flock, each shepherd will use his own distinctive whistle. The sheep recognizes the sound of its own shepherd's voice and will then go towards that sound. So when God acts like a shepherd and hisses for his flock Israel, they will recognize the voice of God. Second, for I have redeemed them. So Israel's redemption is the basis for their regathering. The regathering follows their national salvation. And third, it says that they shall increase as they have increased. In fact, a population explosion is promised among the Jewish people. And then fourth, in verse 9, I will sow them among the peoples. So what we see here is that even after their regathering, they'll be sent out among the Gentiles again, but not this time in a forced dispersion as a sign of judgment, but in order to spread the good news about the Messiah among the Gentile nations in the kingdom. This is in the Messianic Kingdom. And then fifth, they shall remember me in far countries. So because of the spread of the Jews among the nations of the world in that future day, God will always be remembered in far off places. And then the sixth thing we see is they shall live with their children. So what does that mean? It means that their children will also carry the word abroad. And seventh, they shall return. So no matter how far they travel, now, no matter how far these Jews who go out, who are sent out from the land to go and preach Jesus, no matter how far they travel with the good news, they will always come back to Israel because that is their homeland, and they'll come back in due time. Now in verses 10 to 11, we see the regathering from among the Gentiles. Verse 10, this emphasizes the regathering itself. I will bring them again also out of the land of Egypt and gather them out of Assyria. So both Egypt and Assyria will be two major areas from which Israel is going to be regathered. And then he says, I'll bring them into the land of Gilead and Lebanon. Now, they're going to occupy the land. And dwelling in Gilead shows that Jews are going to live on the east side of the Jordan, because that's where Gilead was, on the east side of the Jordan. This is ancient Gilead was on the east side of the Jordan. It says they're also going to live in Lebanon. Now, Lebanon today is part of the land of Israel. Lebanon was an area the Jews never could conquer, although it was part of the promised land. But in the Messianic Kingdom, they're going to inhabit what is Lebanon today. And he says, no place shall be found for them. What does that mean? It means that the land of Israel will be so populated that there will be no more room for further settlement. And then in verse 11, he deals with the punishment of the Gentiles. He will pass through the sea of affliction. Now, the sea of affliction here refers to the Red Sea through which the Jews once passed, fleeing from the Egyptians. All the depths of the Nile shall dry up. Now, if the river Nile serves as a barrier to Israel's final regathering and restoration, then it will be dried up. The pride of Assyria shall be brought low. So there's going to be no hindrances coming from Assyria. And even the river Euphrates, which is the northern boundary of the land of the promised land of Israel, which might serve as a hindrance, that's going to be smitten into 7 smaller streams, according to Isaiah the prophet. And that's going to make it far easier for returning Jews to pass over. It won't be one big river anymore. It'll be just into 7 smaller streams. He says the sceptre of Egypt shall depart. Well, sceptre, we know, is a symbol of kingship. And so this means that the royal house of Egypt will pass into oblivion. Egypt will be without its own king. So this whole prophecy concerning the regathering from Assyria and Egypt and reducing any waterways that might become obstacles to Israel's return is also spelled out by Isaiah in Isaiah 11, verses 15 to 16. And finally, in verse 12, what we have here is Israel's spiritual restoration. I will strengthen them in Jehovah, and they shall walk up and down in his name, says Jehovah. So Israel will remain a saved, regenerate nation right throughout the Messianic Kingdom. Every Jew born in the kingdom will believe in Messiah. So all of Israel will be saved at that in that kingdom. Everyone will believe in Jesus. In chapter 11, verses 1 to 17, what we have is the rejection of the true shepherd. And this is the last main subdivision of what was Zechariah's first burden, in which the prophet dealt with the rejection of the true shepherd. You know, the true shepherd we know is Jesus. So the passage here is divided up into 3 smaller units. So we're going to just have a quick look. First up, we see the devastation of the land. And this is in verses 1 to 3 of chapter 11. Open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O fir-tree, for the cedar is fallen, because the goodly ones are destroyed. Wail, O ye oaks of Bashan, for the strong forest is come down. A voice of the wailing of the shepherds, for their glory is destroyed. A voice of the roaring of young lions, for the pride of the Jordan is laid waste. Now, as Zechariah discusses the rejection of the true shepherd, he begins by describing a devastation of the land in verses 1 to 3. This comes as a result of this rejection of the true shepherd. He focuses first of all on Lebanon in verses 1 to 2, the first part of verse 2. He says, open your doors, O Lebanon. Now, the reason here is so that the fire may devour your cedars. Now, Lebanon, we know, was famous for its cedar trees. And as a result, the fir tree is now told to wail, for the cedar is fallen, and the goodly ones are destroyed. Now, what does all that mean? Well, often the Jewish temple was described as the house of cedar. And you can find that in 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 5 to 6. So it seems that Zechariah is concentrating his thinking here on the Jewish temple, pointing out that the temple, which even then when they were being seen being erected, would someday be destroyed. Remember, Zechariah is here encouraging the men to rebuild the second temple, Zerubbabel's temple, but what he's looking at here is something that is future. Now, the fir tree was used by Solomon to make floors, doors, and ceilings, and the ceiling panels in Solomon's temple. Again, 1 Kings 6, 15, and 34 tell us this. 1 Kings 6, 15, and 34 tell us about the fir tree used by Solomon to make panels in the temple. Now, 40 years before the destruction of the second temple, around the time of Jesus' crucifixion, the gates of the temple opened of their own accord. And Rabbi Yohanan, in alarm, made this remark found in the tract called the Masaketh Joma. And he says, now I know, when he saw the doors swing open, now I know, said he, that the destruction of the temple is at hand, according to the prophecy of Zechariah. Open thy doors, O Lebanon, the fire may devour thy cedars. So with that door swinging open, that rabbi was able to see that that meant that the temple was going to be destroyed. The second part of verse 2, he considers the land of Bashan, which today is part of the Golan Heights. Wail, O ye oaks of Bashan, for the strong forest is come down. Now, Bashan should weep because the mighty cedar of Lebanon has also fallen. And in verse 3, we have the wailing of the shepherds, a voice of the wailing of the shepherds. So these shepherds are the Jewish leaders. And the reason for their wailing is for their glory is destroyed. Now, when Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed, then their glory is also destroyed. So the destruction of their city and the temple is the cause of the wailing of the shepherds. Oops. Finally, he focuses on the Jordan Valley in the second part of verse 3. He talks about the voice of the roaring of the young lions. Now, for the reason is that the pride of the Jordan is laid waste. The pride of the Jordan is the Jordan Valley. And these are the areas of the Jordan River whose banks were heavily filled with vegetation. It was lush with bushes and woods. And this is mentioned 3 times by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 12, verse 5, Jeremiah 49:19, Jeremiah 50, verse 44. Now, it was in these woods young lions used to live. The devastation described in verses 1 to 3 was fulfilled in the year AD 70. So this much of the prophecy has already been fulfilled. Now, having described the destruction of the land of Israel from north to south, including Lebanon, Bashan or the Golan Heights and the Jordan Valley, and especially the temple in verses 4 to 14, he now explains the reason for the devastation in verses 1 to 3. And that is the rejection of the true shepherd. So what we see described in verses 1 to 3 was a type of destruction that was fulfilled in the year AD 70. This cannot be the Babylonian destruction because Zechariah lived after that had taken place. Remember, this is the rebuilding of the temple after the 70-year period. He was living at the time when the second temple was being rebuilt. So what he is describing here is something that is still future to his day. The only other such time a devastation occurred, which included the devastation of the Jewish temple, was the Roman destruction in AD 70. So the first 3 verses of chapter 11 predicted the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the Roman devastation of the entire land, fulfilled in AD 70. In verses 4 to 14, we see the true shepherd, and we see the commission to the prophet Zechariah in verses 4 to 6. Thus says Jehovah, my God, feed the flock of slaughter, whose possessors slay them, and hold themselves not guilty. And they that sell them say, blessed be Jehovah, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. For I will no more pity the inhabitants of the land, says Jehovah. But lo, I will deliver the men, every one into his neighbor's hand, and into the hand of his king. And they shall smite the land, and out of their hand I will not deliver them. Now, as he discusses the reason for the devastation of the land as described in verses 1 to 3, Zechariah says the reason is their rejection of the true shepherd in verses 4 to 14. Now, Zechariah the prophet, he was given a commission, and that was to play the role of a shepherd in verses 4 to 6. In verse 4, the emphasis here is on the flock. Thus says Jehovah my God. Here, Zechariah is referring to God as his own personal God. His commission is to feed the flock of slaughter. And this phrase refers to Israel as a whole. This means that as a flock, they are already destined for slaughter. Their destruction will be by Rome, fulfilling the prophecy of verses 1 to 3 in AD 70. So here, Zechariah, playing the Messianic, he role feeds the flock which later would be played by the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, who is called the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10, verse 11 and 14. John 10, 11 and 14. And verses 5 to 6 describe 2 things. And these are 2 things about the condition of the flock. In verse 5, it has been abandoned by man. He says, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty. Now, in the context of its fulfillment, their possessors were the Romans, who slew the Jewish people and did not feel in any way guilty of any crime. But he mentions another group here. He mentions their own shepherds. These are the Jewish leaders who had no pity on their own people either. And it says, and they that sell them say, blessed be Jehovah, for I am rich. So the leaders themselves sell out the people in order to become rich. They pity them not. They have these leaders, these shepherds have no pity on their own people. And so the flock has been abandoned by man. Possessors were the Roman Gentiles. The shepherds, like those of verse 3, were the Jewish leaders. In verse 6, we find that this flock has also been abandoned by God. First of all, he says, I will no more pity the inhabitants of the land. That's the land of Israel. God will remove his mercy from them so that the first 3 verses could be fulfilled. Second, but lo, I will deliver the men, every one, into the hand of his neighbor. Now, what does that mean? Well, one of the things that weakened the Jewish defenses in the Roman war between AD 66 and 70 was that various Jewish factions began fighting among themselves. And this civil strife among the Jews greatly weakened their ability to withstand the Romans. The third thing we see is that God will deliver every man into the hand of his king. Now, in John chapter 19, verse 15, during the course of Jesus's trial, the Jewish people cried out, "We have no king but Caesar." So the point here is this: if Caesar is their king, God would deliver them into his hand. The fourth thing he says here is that they shall smite the land. This has already been described in verses 1 to 3. The fifth thing he says is that there will be no deliverance. Out of their hand, I will not deliver them. God will not rescue them from the hands of the Romans when that happens in AD 70. At the time when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, a total of 1.1 million Jews were killed. 1.1 million. 97,000 Jews were carried off into slavery. So in verses 4 to 6, Zechariah was told to play the role which the Messiah will play someday, to feed a flock destined for slaughter by the Roman Empire, abandoned both by man and God. In verses 7 to 11, Zechariah plays the role of the Messiah in carrying out his commission. Beginning in verse 7, we're told he did the feeding of the flock. So I fed the flock of slaughter. He did minister to all Israel, but verily the poor of the flock. So while his ministry was offered to the flock as a whole, there was a special emphasis on his ministry to the poor of the flock. And the poor of the flock was that element who accepted him and his message. The flock of slaughter as a whole is the people of Israel, but the poor of the flock is the believing remnant, the Israel of God. And we see the fulfillment of this in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 to 36. Jesus came to all Israel and offered himself as Israel's Messiah. However, what we know is that as things developed, he ended up being accepted only by the poor of the flock, the believing remnant. And eventually, these were the ones to which he ministered. Then he says, I took unto me 2 staves. To help him carry out his work as a shepherd, he had 2 staves, or 2 stout poles. One of them he called beauty. The Hebrew word noam means graciousness. The purpose of this first staff was for the protection of the flock. The other staff he called bands. The Hebrew word shabel means binding. The purpose of the second staff was to keep the flock together. So it emphasizes the unity of the flock, and goes on to say, and so I fed the flock. In this way, Zechariah fulfilled his commission. The flock was fed. He did not fail in fulfilling that which God had commanded him to do. Now in verse 8, he talks about the destruction of the other shepherds. And I cut off 3 shepherds in 1 month. Now, these 3 shepherds could be seen as prophetically the priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people. Others also see it as the civil authorities, the priests, and the false prophets. Others see them as the lawyers, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. However, looking at the New Testament context, we would say that these three shepherds are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. These were the three main groups of leaders who rejected the true shepherd. Now, the reason Zechariah had to decree judgment against them was because of mutual antagonism. He says, "For my soul was weary of them, and their soul also loathed me." Now, Jesus' weariness of them is seen in his denunciation of the leaders in Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 37. Their loathing of him is seen in their success in driving Judas Iscariot to betray him and then pursuing his trial and death. However, although for a while the prophet did fulfill his commission and fed the flock using his two staves to protect them and keep them together, and then cut off these three types of rulers, nevertheless, we see in verse 9, at some point, there came an end to the feeding of the flock. Then said I will not feed you. At some point, the feeding stopped. As far as the nation as a whole was concerned, there was a split, a separation of the good shepherd from the people. And so he left off feeding them and he left them to the natural course of events. That which dies, let it die, even if it is from starvation. That which is to be cut off, let it be cut off. This is inferring here a violent death as by the sword. Let them that are left eat every one the flesh of another. This was literally fulfilled in cannibalism during the siege of Jerusalem. Now, at that point in verse 10, Zechariah broke one of his staves, the one called Beauty, representing graciousness. And I took my staff Beauty and cut it asunder. At some point, grace and protection was removed, that I might break my covenant which I had made with all the peoples. The covenant made with the Gentiles is broken. Now, this was a covenant which said they could not harm Israel until God allows it. So now God does allow it. And the Gentiles from now on begin to hurt Israel. There have been similar covenants or restraints imposed by God, and we can find these in other books like Job, Job 5, verse 23, Hosea 2, verse 20, Ezekiel 34, 25. So these are not one of the 5 covenants made with Israel. These are just a covenant that God makes, not a conditional or an unconditional covenant. It's simply just an agreement. So these are Job 5, verse 23, Hosea 2, verse 20, Ezekiel 34, 25. Yeah, the fulfillment of this is recorded in Luke 19, verse 41 to 44, and Luke 21, verse 24. Now, this rupturing of Beauty, remember Beauty was graciousness and for the protection of the flock, was fulfilled in Matthew 12, verses 22 to 45. At that point, there came a rejection of the messiahship of Jesus by the Jewish leaders. And this was on the basis that he was demon possessed. At that point, the rupture occurred, and Jesus now pronounced them guilty of the unpardonable sin because of their blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. He tells them immediately they were now subject to divine judgment, which would come in AD 70. And at that point, grace and protection was withdrawn from the flock of Israel. In verse 11, he describes the effects of these actions upon the poor of the flock. And it was broken in that day. And what happened? The poor of the flock that gave heed unto me knew that it was the word of Jehovah. The poor means the Jewish believers, and often the believing remnant is described, as in Isaiah, for example, as the poor and needy. In reference to the believing remnant in Israel during the earthly ministry of Jesus, they recognize that what he did in Matthew 12 was the word of Jehovah, and they would act accordingly. Now, these are the ones who did give heed to him, who did believe in him. This was fulfilled in the flight of the Jewish believers to a place called Pella, P-E-L-L-A. In Luke 21, 20-21, Jesus warned them that when they saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies, they were not to take up weapons to help defend the city. But when they saw this happen, this was a sign that Jerusalem was about to be destroyed as judgment for committing the unpardonable sin. This was also a sign that the effects of the breaking of the first staff of beauty was about to take place. Therefore, they were not to get involved in defending the city, but to abandon it and to flee to the mountains. The Jewish believers did see this happen, then they did recognize it to be the word of God. So in AD 66, when the Jewish revolt initially broke out, the Roman general Cestus Gallus, he brought the legions out of Rome and he surrounded the city. The Jewish believers, the poor of the flock, took this to be the sign given in Luke 21, verses 20-21. They knew they had to leave Jerusalem, but so long as the Romans were besieging them, it was not possible. However, Cestus Gallus soon realized that his supply lines were being cut. He had not secured them, and he found that this Jewish revolt was much more widespread than he realized and was not confined locally to Jerusalem. So he was forced to lift the siege temporarily, but on his way back to Caesarea, he was attacked and killed by Jewish forces. Suddenly, Jerusalem was no longer under siege, so the Jewish believers then took their opportunity to abandon the city. And this fulfills the statement made in this verse 11, that the poor of the flock that gave heed unto me, unto the good shepherd, knew that this was the word of Jehovah. They recognized the breaking of the first staff and the removal of the protection, and so they abandoned Jerusalem to its destruction. And they waited out in the war in Pella, while 1.1 million of their fellow Jews were killed and 97,000 went into slavery. But because the believers were obedient to the Messiah, the true shepherd, not one of them lost his life in that war, nor went into slavery. Now in verses 12-14 of chapter 11, we see the price of the good shepherd. And I said unto them, if you think good, give me my hire, and if not, forbear. So they weighed for my hire 30 pieces of silver. And Jehovah said unto me, cast it unto the potter, the goodly price that I was prized at by them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them unto the potter in the house of Jehovah. Then I cut asunder mine other staff, even bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. So in this passage, Zechariah concludes the segment with the price of the true shepherd. Verse 12 deals with the attitude of the Jewish elders towards the true shepherd. And I said unto them, so after finishing his work, Messiah is pictured here as saying to the leaders of Israel, if you think good, give me my hire, and if not, forbear. In other words, as we did not agree on a price in advance, pay me what you think I'm worth. If my work proved good to you, then pay me what it's worth. But if not, then give me nothing. But it says, so they weighed for my hire 30 pieces of silver. Now that was definitely not a compliment. At that time, this amount, 30 pieces of silver, was a sign and a symbol of contempt. It originates in Exodus 21, verse 32, which says that if your ox gored your neighbor's servant to death, you were obligated to pay your neighbor 30 pieces of silver. Now, that was the value of a dead slave. Later, if you wish to show contempt for someone, you would convey this by giving him 30 pieces of silver, saying thereby, You are worth no more to me than a dead slave. So it was a price of contempt. And it is in this context that the 30 pieces of silver actually fits. So Zechariah, who's playing this good shepherd, was given the price of a dead slave as a sign that he was held in contempt. And this was fulfilled in the life of Jesus in Matthew 26, verses 14 to 16. And verse 13, the prophet received another commission. And Jehovah said unto me, cast it onto the potter. So after playing out a role of the Messiah, God again appears to him and tells him to take this silver money and cast it into the potter's area of the temple compound. Then God says, this is the goodly price whereof I was prized at by them. This means that God himself was being sold out for 30 pieces of silver. The expression goodly price is a sarcastic remark. It literally means splendid value. They valued me splendidly by paying 30 pieces of silver for me. God says, take this money, this splendid value at which I was prized by them. Essentially, what the prophet is saying here is that God himself was being sold out for this price, the price of contempt. In the second part of verse 13, Zechariah carries out this commission. He says, I took the 30 pieces of silver and I cast them onto the potter in the house of Jehovah. Now, the fulfillment of this is recorded in Matthew 27, verses 3 to 10. When the Jewish leaders sold out Jesus to Judas for 30 pieces of silver, the amount was deliberate. It was to show their contempt for Jesus. And at this point in verse 14, we have the breaking of the second staff, bands. Then I cut asunder mine other staff, even bands. And so the unity among the Jews was now destroyed. In the war against Rome between AD 66 and AD 70, various factions were formed among the zealots, and they began to kill each other off, and they weakened themselves before the Romans returned. They even destroyed each other's foodstuffs, leading to the famine that would soon follow. Ultimately, it was the internal strife within Jerusalem itself which caused it to fall easily to the Romans. And the purpose of the breaking of the staff bands was that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. And that is why civil strife came to pass. Now, as a result, the Jews were scattered. This is something Zechariah is going to bring out in Zechariah 13, verses 7 to 9. Now, before concluding this section, it might be pointed out that the 30 pieces of silver that the chief priests paid to Judas came out of the temple treasury, which was supposed to be for the purpose of purchasing sacrifices. Now, while that was definitely not their intention, it is exactly what they did. What they did that day was that they purchased a sacrifice with their 30 pieces of silver, and that was the final sacrifice for sin. Now, what's this chapter been saying so far? Well, first of all, before the destruction of verses 1 to 3, the Messiah will come. Second, the believing remnant will follow him. Third, but others, especially the Jewish leaders, will value him equal to a dead slave. And fourth, the consequence will be that the people will be given over to the Gentiles and then scattered. And fifth, Messiah is pictured as the good shepherd of this prophecy in John chapter 10, verses 11 to 18. Now, this brings us to the closing segment of this chapter. Now, we look at the foolish shepherd, and this we find in verses 15 to 17 of chapter 11. And Jehovah said unto me, take unto you yet again the instruments of a foolish shepherd. For lo, I will raise up a shepherd in the land who will not visit those that are cut off, neither will seek those who are scattered, nor heal that which is broken, nor feed that which is sound, but he will eat the flesh of the fat sheep and will tear their hoofs in pieces. Woe to the worthless shepherd that leaves the flock. The sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened. Here in these verses, we have the account of the foolish shepherd whom Israel will accept. In verse 15, the prophet is commissioned once again. Take unto you yet again. So he's now to play a second role, but this time he's to act as a foolish shepherd or a false shepherd. He is told to take up the instruments of a foolish shepherd. Now, instruments are the same, but the difference is in the way that they're used. The good shepherd uses them correctly. The foolish shepherd uses them incorrectly. Now in verse 16, he's told the reason for playing this second role and the purpose of it. For lo, I will raise up a shepherd in the land. So God is going to raise up another shepherd in the land, a false one. This means that God is going to bring him onto the scene. Several things are said about him. First of all, he will not visit them that are cut off. So he's going to have no concern for the flock as a true shepherd did. Second, neither will he seek those that are scattered. The true shepherd did just that. Third, nor heal that which is broken, which the true shepherd did. Fourth, nor feed that which is sound, which the true shepherd did. Fifth, he will eat the flesh of the fat sheep. In other words, he will use the flock for his own self-satisfaction. And sixth, he will tear their hoofs in pieces, destroying the flock in order to become rich himself. The point of verse 16 here is to show that the reason why Zechariah is to play the role of a foolish shepherd is because a foolish shepherd will indeed arise from the land of Israel, and he will be accepted by the people, but he will not do all the things which the good shepherd did. While some see this as being fulfilled in the future by the Antichrist, it's unlikely because this has already been fulfilled, because it is part of those things which resulted in the devastation of the land. First Messiah in Jewish history was Jesus. No one had ever claimed to be the Messiah before Jesus, and he died in AD 30. But 100 years later came the first false Messiah who led the second Jewish revolt against Rome. His name was Simon Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kokhba. Now, it was changed to Bar Kokhba. Now, he led a revolt against Rome between the years AD 132 to 135. And because of his initial successes in defeating the Romans in the first half of the war, he was declared to be the Jewish Messiah by Rabbi Akiba, who was a leading rabbi, and many other members of the Jewish Sanhedrin did the same. Now, it was he who fulfilled these verses as a foolish shepherd. He brought about the second revolt, which failed, causing complete devastation of the land to the point where Jerusalem became off limits to all Jews. In verse 17, he announces the judgment on the foolish shepherd. Woe to the worthless shepherd that leaves the flock. Bar Kokhba was a false leader who only brought about even further devastation and an even further division between Jews who believed in Jesus and those who did not. Zechariah declared, the sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. Now, this focus on his arm and his right eye probably means that these things actually happened to Bar Kokhba prior to his being killed by the Romans. Concerning his arm, he says his arm should be clean, dried up. The arm was supposed to have been used to protect the flock, but it was not. This corresponds to the staff named Beauty. But Bar Kokhba did not fulfill his function with graciousness. Concerning his eye, he says his right eye should be utterly darkened. He'll go blind in his right eye. That which should have been used to watch over the flock so that it does not scatter failed. And this corresponds to the second staff, bands. So Bar Kokhba failed to fulfill the purpose of that staff as well. Basically, the devastation of the land in verses 1 to 3 comes about because of the rejection of the true shepherd in verses 4 to 14. And then the acceptance of the false shepherd in verses 16 to 17. And that brought about the devastation of the land. In fact, after that, after the 132 to 135, with Bar Kokhba, I think it was Hadrian, just completely, he plowed over Jerusalem with salt so that nobody could use it anymore. That brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.